Welcome back. So, next we've got an enterprise story for you, which will be looking at a business case of AI adoption. Our speaker is Matt Galvin, Global Vice President of Ethics and Compliance at Anheuser-Busch InBev. Matt has transformed the compliance industry for AB InBev and for the wider RegTech industry through technology. Matt turned to artificial intelligence and machine learning to create BrewRIGHT, a platform that quickly reviews financial transactions across the globe for any potential illicit activity. The application shows how AI and other advanced tech is permeating all aspects of business, even departments like legal that are typically less quick to adopt the latest and greatest technology. Here to give a presentation entitled BrewRIGHT, Cracking Corruption in the World's Largest Brewery, we're thrilled to welcome Matt to the stage. Hi, Matt. Over to you.
Hi, thanks so much. It's really great to be here today. And so I oversee ethics and compliance for AB InBev. AB InBev is the largest brewer in the world. Roughly 1 in 3 beers in the world is one of ours. And what I cover is, anti-corruption, antitrust, disputes, and all internal investigations for the company. And what makes us different in terms of how we approach compliance is two things, really. One, AB InBev as a company, as global as we are, we're hyper local. 90% of our supply chain is in local markets. Why? Because beer's heavy, right? Water, hops, barley, aluminum, these are all heavy products that you don't want to source around the world. So unlike, say, a tech company, which might manufacture in China and assemble parts and have sales organizations, we have entirely localized supply chains in about 80 countries. And the other thing that makes us different is we have trained people all around the world in compliance programs to operate in kind of very standardized, structured ways to create data sets, to build models, to identify fraud, to identify corruption, to identify those components of our supply chain that behave in ways that are aberrant or that suggest fraud, corruption, or evasion of control. And so, that in itself is very exciting. And some of it is, by no means are we a perfect program. By no means do we have perfect algorithms. It's really that we're just innovating and advancing in a space that, technologically hasn't innovated or advanced for, that much time. Now, what's really exciting about this is, when you think about it's not the technology, because the technology is basic, right? As the previous speaker said, a lot of the neural network, and machine learning, regression analysis, I mean, statistics have been there for, centuries, and neural networks have been around for 20, 30 years. I think what's different is, some of it is the computing power and the access to data, but some of it is the people and the ability to take a look at the technology and start asking questions in different ways. And what we saw within our own market, was a lot of compliance programs, a lot of like legal programs are about, process and documentation. And that we want to kind of show and prove that we followed certain processes. So if that something goes wrong, we can say, well, we did everything we could and we have the documents to show it. But process and documentation are not big behavioral influencers. How many documents have you filled out in your life that have actually changed your behavior? Probably not that many, right? Maybe a college application or a university application might have, somewhat made you think, oh, I should behave in a certain way so I can fill out this extracurricular box a little bit differently. At that point, you're probably a little bit too late. And often, even if it is going to influence you, it's influencing you probably too late in the game to really make that much difference. But what we found early on, even as our models in early stages were really just, advancing a little bit better than random, was by merely bringing data in and kind of putting visualization around data, we were driving transparency, and different functions could have very advanced conversations and very efficient conversations. So, for example, if control suggested to procurement in a certain group, we're seeing too many vendors being hired without going through process. Procurement, of course, says, no, 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 we're perfect. But if you have the data immediately and you can see your behavior and accounting system that shows, no, we're paying people before they're processed or onboarded as vendors, well, then that's extremely powerful, and you can move behavior and create more accountability just by showing transparency. Now, I think really what's exciting about the future is taking that a step further. And I think corporations in this moment, in this moment today in the US, where everyone was kind of braced for the verdict in Minnesota and really questioning what is corporations' role within society? What is our corporations' role and how should we behave with our stakeholders and markets? And what should be compliance's role? And if you look and think, okay, one of the things I need to cover in a company with operations around the world is corruption compliance. And historically, my goal was to just kind of document that we're trying to do the right thing. And now we've kind of advanced to say, okay, now my role is to drive transparency throughout the organization. The next logical step of that wouldn't just be to drive transparency through organization. It would be to drive transparency across the markets where we operate. Because 90% of corruption cases, it's not just a company grabbing a bag of cash and going out. It's about a network of suppliers and creating margins of money that people can use to kind of fool their control functions to pay bribes and work with either corrupt agents of other companies or corrupt officials. And that's really how corruption works. Now, there's been a lot of policing of corruption, by the U.S. through the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, by the U.K. regulators, now in France and Brazil and in China, and I think the reviews and whether that's actually been effective have been mixed. The World Economic Forum estimates that roughly $3 trillion of the global economy is lost from corruption. And yet, that's in spite of huge efforts by the US to police global corruption. And they've taken over $2 billion in fines from multinationals in the last 10 years to try and encourage behavior. Yet all this regulatory action, I think, has done very little impact in actual underlying corruption. And it's driven a lot of compliance and process, a lot of documentation. In some respects, it's delivering more effects-based compliance and transparency. But how much has it really done to drive transparency across markets and really get at the underlying root cause of corruption? And I think the question we should start to ask ourselves as multinationals and as corporations isn't just how do we maintain compliance, but how do we drive better behavior in the markets where we operate? And that's really what we should go to. And that's really what the promise of analytics and the promise of new technologies is going to bring. Now let's start with where we are now, and then we can go to where we are tomorrow. Right now, AB InBev has, we take all of our ERP systems, our enterprise resource planning, our SAP systems, or Oracle, right, the accounting, the general ledger. And we've taken that from 16 different countries, and we have really effectively 15 different compliance apps. Now, each app is designed to allow a compliance professional to do something in a more efficient way, much like the apps on your smartphone. And now, as people use that, much the way tech companies use the apps in your smartphone, those create data sets, and those data sets are used for 5 of the 15 to do more advanced machine learning and artificial intelligence to start to get to predicting certain compliance behaviors. That allows compliance professionals at the local level to do their jobs more efficiently. It allows me at a global level to kind of identify where risk is, and that feedback loop helps to advance compliance behavior. So let me give you an example. This is what, if you were to open up BrewRIGHT, this is what it looks like. Your 15 different apps. You have an app to say, okay, who in my vendor population, who are we paying money to that's likely interacting with the government? And our models there are roughly, we went from 6% accuracy 4 years ago to now, depending on the market, between, an F1 of, the 60 to 70% range, and, a high degree of accuracy in some markets, up to 90% accuracy in terms of who's interacting with government. We have apps to say, okay, once you're paying those vendors, what is the indication of within the transaction profile? So the actual kind of payment going out of fraud, corruption, or evasion of control. And there we went from an accuracy of 0.4% 5 years ago to an F1 score in the mid 20s. Right? We actually predicted in proactive monitoring almost 1 in 3 cases of something that we needed to further investigate. So that's going from 1 in 220 to 1 in 3 in 5 years. And that gives you a flavor of different apps and different workflows that we have. If someone kind of cuts a one-off payment, we have an app to really look at that. Once you start, managing your third-party risk and your agents, then the next thing in our company that you're likely to use is maybe your corporate credit card spend. And we have apps to kind of look at clusters of employees against each other to detect anomalies there. Or you start maybe giving beer away for free. Because who wouldn't do a lot for a truckload of beer? And we have apps to kind of identify, free beer or truckloads of beer that we can kind of detect and look at anomaly and kind of disposition of product. And we have other processes to look at, whistleblowing lines and how we're addressing whistleblowers, underlying scores and the quality of the data, because you have to differentiate between having, say, a high quality data set that we might have in a market like Brazil with a lesser quality data set that I might have in a market like Uganda. And instead of kind of overly penalizing Brazil for having good data, we kind of diffract and affect the risk score based upon the quality of data and different quality of data indices that affect the risk scoring and behavior. Now, from an internal perspective, you start to affect people's behavior by marrying their targets and their incentives against the performance of risk scores. And eventually, we want to get to the point that business unit leaders themselves will have a sales target and an analytically driven compliance target, and their compensation is based upon both. We're not there yet, but I do have compliance teams all around the world whose compensation is tied to the performance of the algorithm, which kind of forces people to kind of drive acceptance and integration. And so, the flow is going to be very, this is like revolutionary to a compliance conference. Here, it's going to be very normal, right? You're taking your data, you're normalizing it, you have a validation process, you model different UI and algorithms, you validate that with teams in the field. They use it to conduct either proactive monitoring investigations, and the feedback from that is used to enhance and enrich the models themselves. What's really exciting about this, and what we took to Davos last year, isn't that we're doing this in BrewRIGHT, right? We've been doing this in AB InBev for 4 to 5 years, and we're kind of changing how a lot of companies look at compliance here. But like a lot of technologies, right, it's not going to scale until a few things happen. It has to be easily and understandable for people to use it. But to get to that, it has to be cheap. And to make it cheap, it's difficult for each company to go on this journey alone, because the process of identifying the relevant data against what test is going to be relevant, against what problem can be solved, this takes a lot of time and energy and expertise to kind of go through. Because if you don't know, if you're not good at aggregating data, then your underlying data is not that good. And if you don't know if your tests are probative or not, then you don't know if you're testing something and getting bad results. Is it because my algorithms are not kind of predicting much, which will happen inevitably in the beginning, or if the underlying data is not that good? And then you have to always ask yourself, to get a more meta question, am I solving the right problem in the first place? And so that's a very expensive process to integrate. And even if you get that right and you start looking at data and kind of the quality of investigative feedback that you need to train a model that has the caliber of what a lawyer or an accountant of, say, 10 years experience can do, that's a very expensive user process. You need very highly trained people to create that data set, right? It's not just swiping left or right on your Stitch Fix app, or taking a Lyft ride. These are things that you need relatively sophisticated people to engage with and create a data set. And so to do that, that can be in a very expensive data set to train. All of this suggests that companies shouldn't try to be like AB InBev or Microsoft, which are kind of the leaders in the space. What we should do is do this collectively, and do it as part of a federated model or a distributed ledger platform, where we can start to validate performance of models through these sophisticated user groups, but in a way without sharing underlying data. And that's what we're doing now. By using federated models and distributed learning technology, we are organizing the first ever data analytics consortium. And it's really going to be extraordinary as it scales up. Right now, we're in a pilot project with a large pharmaceutical company comparing projects and algorithms in Brazil. And as the previous speaker said, these things take a little more time. You're not going to create, you're not going to do this level of normalization, get this complicated amount of data, get this complicated level of review and train models overnight. But it's going to happen. I think we've been at this for 4 or 5 years. I think we can replicate the advancement that we had in 4 or 5 years as a single company, probably in about 6 months, doing it alongside another company. Basically, because data normalization is a lot better. We're already starting at an advanced point with models that we know work. And we'll just have the benefit of kind of scaling up and improving kind of user feedback and flow. Because the other thing that you can imagine is a problem in detecting fraud or corruption is you have a very asymmetric data set. Your examples of very good data are, infinitely greater than the very small data set that you need to replicate for fraud or corruption. Again, That's something that will be solved by having an increased number of market participants. And the more people that participate in this network, the faster your algorithms are going to grow, and the faster your problems are going to, address. So what does that mean? Well, it means conducting compliance and legal investigations internally will be much cheaper because you can share costs of normalization, you can share costs of usage, you can share costs of training, and you just get a better output that's going to make it cheap. And the cheaper it goes, the more people that will buy into it. And what's interesting when you think about the market dynamic of this, because it's a regulated space, at a certain point, if 10 or 20 companies are trying to identify corruption in this way, well, wouldn't how do you justify to a regulator if you get in trouble not doing that? And once you have 100 companies, though, then it's a very clear expectation. And once you're at 300, how could the rest of the S&P 500 not kind of participate in this? And then you start to grow and grow. And I think you'll hit a point of exponential growth across companies, which will then exponentially teach the models and advance the models. Now, that should do very interesting things across markets. That should do very interesting things to how governments look at companies' use of data. Because if you have market participants engaged in this way, well, then you start to incentivize behavior of downstream. Because if you're a vendor in Nigeria and all of the multinationals are looking at this way, then you want to ensure that your vendor profile in the system is good. Otherwise, they won't be able to safely engage with you. They want to make sure that you don't get flagged for improper behavior or anomalous kind of dealings with funds, because there will be repercussions for that. And if you have collective action upstream, you'll start to incentivize it downstream within markets. And you also create an expectation across regulators and governments that this is how the world should work. And if you go back to the initial concept of, well, as a compliance officer, should our job be just to protect the company, or should our job be, can I underline and make the markets where we're operating a little bit better, a little bit more transparent, and behave in a more optimal way? And that is the promise of the technology, and that is the promise of tomorrow. Because as much as corruption is a huge inhibitor on growth, right? That $3 trillion figure of the World Economic Forum, for a company such as ours, we rise and fall as emerging markets make decisions where they want to move towards more safe, stable product lines. A beer as opposed to, a home brew alcohol that's made out of a pot. I mean, that's kind of the trend, a transition of a developing world. And the more we can help the markets where we operate rise, the more we're going to have a more engaged, mature consumer base, and the better we are for everyone. And so I firmly believe that it's not just in our interest as a compliance organization to try and do this and drive transparency within the organization, but really it's our job as compliance and legal to look at these technologies, look at the amazing advancements of smart contracts and distributed ledger to drive transparency through supply chains, and really understand where we are and what is our place as multinationals in these markets, and really use it to influence change. Another kind of interesting kind of feature of this, as we think about our jobs, right, and how the job of a lawyer was previously just to kind of build an asset in yourself of experience, so you give better advice over time. But now we have the opportunity to kind of be a force multiplier of that experience and create assets and create algorithms that will just live and be beyond us and scalable in a way so that I can have my legal advice operating as an automated way in systems across the world. And to do that, and you think about that trajectory and how we're trying to build, a company at AB InBev and how we're trying to build this network, it really means we need integrated hybrid teams, people that understand how the algorithms work, people that can communicate well, from the legal department to the compliance department to the AI team to the underlying data teams. All of these people need to be able to communicate and work in harmony so that you can build these assets and so the system can work. But eventually, we are where we are now. And I think when we look at the next year, 2, 3 years, you're going to see radical transformation in how compliance works across multinationals. And it's really an exciting moment of time. I know it will sound funny to this room, but it's really an exciting moment of time to be in compliance. So thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Thank you for the opportunity to share this vision. And we look forward to how this is going to change tomorrow and how AI will drive and build transparency and hopefully address issues around global corruption. Thanks a lot.
Matt, thank you so much. Gosh, you've talked so much about how the role of compliance officers can change as technology scales across many industries, and equally how it will impact the role of many other roles as we're all looking to future proof ourselves.